Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're going to be going over the history and geography of Croatia, this country right here in the Balkans of Southeast Europe. Let me get my pencil so I can point out some interesting places in its geography. Croatia's geography is very much dominated by its very beautiful coastline here on the Adriatic Sea. It's absolutely gorgeous. The pictures out of there are so lovely. It looks heavenly. And they did film a lot of Game of Thrones on the Croatian coastline as well, if you want a good visual of what it looks like on the coast. And you can see all of these little islands off of its coast. Croatia actually has 1,246 different islands and islets, but around 50 or so are inhabited. The two largest islands are Kres and Krk, right there. Croatia also borders many different countries. It borders Slovenia up here. It borders Hungary. It borders Serbia, most notably the northern area of Vojvodina. It has this huge border with Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it has a very teeny tiny border right here with Montenegro. Actually very interesting. Croatia has an exclave right here. An exclave is a part of a country where it's split off from the rest of the country by another country. For example, Alaska would be an exclave of the United States. I mentioned this in my video on Bosnia and Herzegovina, that they have a very tiny little coastline right here. So Croatia is split off from this whole half, which there is a very major city of Dubrovnik right there. So they're actually building a bridge to connect these two parts. It should be open in 2022. So it technically won't be an exclave, but technically will, but technically won't. So on and so forth. Historically, Croatia split into 4 different areas. The one down here is known as Dalmatia. You can see it says there, Dalmatia. And yes, it's where the Dalmatian dogs come from. We have this area up here known as Istra. And this area over here known as Slavonia. And then this middle section would be Croatia proper, where we can find the capital city of Zagreb. But geographically, Croatia would really be split into 2 different zones. The mountainous Dinaric Alps, see right there, Dinaric Alps, splits right down here. Big mountain chain, and it even splits into another mountain chain right here along its coast. The Velebit Mountains, I couldn't find a way to pronounce that, so I hope that's right. There's also this little mountain chain over here, the Papuk. And then this whole section down here is known as the Pannonian Basin, which would be like a big runoff from the mountains. And there are many rivers in this area. It's very flat. I mean, not very flat, it is hilly, but much flatter than the mountains over here, you know. So, river-wise, Croatia does have the Danube on its border. Right along here, it makes up this border with Serbia. But it does have, like I said, many other rivers. The other important ones would be the Sava River, which you can see flowing here through Zagreb, and then it flows down and makes up this part of the border with Bosnia and Herzegovina. There's also the Drava River, which comes down here and makes up this border with Hungary. And both rivers flow into the Danube, but there's like many other rivers that crisscross, and many of them flow into the Danube actually, because it's a runoff basin. That's its job. And let's see, one other thing I want to point out I'm going to show you on this map over here, because it's not labeled on this one, is this really beautiful national park located right here in the Dinaric Alps, right on its border with Bosnia and Herzegovina. Let me grab... I have a cat in my lap, so it's a little hard to reach. I did a video on the world's most beautiful places, and we talked about the Plitvice Lakes in Croatia, which is what this is, the Plitvice Lakes National Park. And it's so beautiful if you can look at pictures of it or videos. There's so many different waterfalls running into these gorgeous blue-green lakes. There's little wood bridges crisscrossing so you can walk over all of them. So many different trails and paths you can take. There goes my pencil. And it's just a gorgeous little area. And from what I can tell in my research, Croatians are very proud of this area, so I did want to point it out. So let me set that aside. Let's start talking about its history. Because I'm sure you've noticed, looking at this geography, that Croatia is very oddly shaped. Like, what's up with that border? You know? So we're going to find out why it's shaped like that in its history. Let's get into it. Alright, so all throughout what is Croatia today, we can find evidence of Neanderthal life, actually, but also lots of early man. Stone Age, Iron Age, those kinds of things all throughout. Croatia has a karst landscape, and karst creates lots of caves. And of course, cavemen love caves, so we can find evidence of them around here. But the first real civilization, so to say, that we know of in this area would have been the Illyrians. And those people settled along the coast here, particularly in the islands, but all in this region of what we know as Dalmatia. And up here as well, you know, all along the coastline. They wound up brushing up against the Roman Empire as it expanded, and they, you know, clashed. And eventually this area was absorbed by the Roman Empire in the year 9 CE. And most notably, the Emperor Diocletian was born in Dalmatia. He built a palace in the city of Split right here. And as the Roman Empire fell apart when it was taken over by the Ostrogoths, and the emperors fled Rome, and you know, people fled, the emperors ruled from that castle in Split until it fell apart even more so. Like I always say in my videos, this is a brief history. I'm not going to go too in depth, so we're going to skip over little parts. We don't need to go over, you know, the Ostrogoths, blah blah blah, taking over. That's true of like almost all of Europe, almost. But the most important invasions in this area would have been in the 7th century. They were the Avars and the Croats, which you can tell by its name would be the more important invasion. They forced out many of the Romans in the area, and in the year 818 they formed the Duchy of Croatia. Christianity came into the equation in about the 9th century. There was a Christianization movement, and the duchy was recognized by the Pope in 879. And that's very important because Croatia today is a very Catholic-dominated country. So, always has been since its very beginning. The first Croat king was Tomislav of the Turpirimović dynasty. And he's very famous for stopping many invasions, like the Hungarians and in particular the Bulgarians. That dynasty came to an end when the Hungarian king claimed his rightful, what's the phrase? Like, you know, he claimed his right to the throne, essentially. There was a clash over that, but in the year 1102, Hungary and Croatia were joined because of that. Letting my cat get off my lap. There we go. Now, it wasn't just the Croatians and the Hungarians in this area, the Venetians came into play as well. The Venetians started to take over the island territories and the Dalmatia area, except Dubrovnik, because that was its own independent entity, actually. They had control over the region by 1428. And we also had the Ottomans, who were making their way up through this part of Europe. And, the Croatians pretty much knew that they wouldn't stand a chance against the Ottomans. There were many battles that they were spectacularly losing. So they went to their neighbors, the Habsburgs, up north. The Habsburgs were a royal family who would eventually control the Austro-Hungarian Empire and would until the end of World War I. Very, very, you have to know the Habsburgs to know your European history. So they asked the Habsburgs to just control their country for them and just oversee everything and make sure that they were protected from the Ottomans, which in a way they did. In 1538, the Habsburgs partitioned Croatia into, thank you, Cat, for loudly grooming yourself. They partitioned Croatia into a civilian zone and a military zone. So the Croatian military frontier was under complete Habsburg control. Regular civilian Croatia was still under control of the king and their parliament, which is known as the Sabor. But the military zone, was 100% Habsburg controlled. Anyone who had lived in that area was now conscripted into the military to fight the Ottomans. Lots of little details about that I'm not going to get into, but it really turned the tide against the Ottoman invasion. And we said at the beginning, why is Croatia shaped like this? It's because this is as far as the Ottomans got before they were stopped by the Habsburgs. I think that's really interesting. You can actually see, this is the river here, but this was the actual, as far as they got. I think that's neat. That's just me. Let's flash forward again to Napoleon. Again, if you're going to know your European history, you have to know Napoleon as well. Not Napoleon himself, but the French Empire wound up invading all the Venetian territories, which would include Dalmatia and all the islands over here. And once that whole enterprise fell apart, the Austrians swept in and took over this territory in 1813. So then that was officially added on to their lands up here. In the 1830s and 1840s, there was a big Croatian national revival movement. The Austrians, like the Habsburgs, were implementing a lot of Germanization programs. The Hungarians were implementing Magyarization, which basically means Hungarian culture. And, to put it bluntly, because this is a whole video topic in and of itself, because there was a lot of shuffling and treaties and skirmishes and reorganizations of the territory in an attempt for kind of everyone to have their way, for everyone to be happy. It's very long and detailed, but it all came to a screeching halt when World War I happened, so we're not going to get into all the little details, because like I said, in World War I, the Habsburg Empire completely fell apart. So in 1918, Croatia declared its independence, and they joined up with their neighbor Serbia over here, and they both created the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes to just sort of make their own country in the area, since, everyone is Slavic. It was a nice, good attempt. There are many attempts coming up, but the first real attempt to try to make one big Slavic country, which really didn't work. The main Croatian party in the kingdom was known as the Croatian Peasant Party. Can you see Belgrade? Yeah. The head of the government was here in Belgrade. It's very far from Croatia, so it was important to have Croatian representation. Their party leader was named Stjepan Radic, and he fought for Croatian rights until the very end, fought against Serbian dominance until he was literally assassinated on the floor of the parliament in 1928. That led to a little domino effect of King Alexander creating a dictatorship in 1929, and he wound up changing the name of the country to Yugoslavia before he himself was assassinated. Now, let's get a little uncomfortable because you know what's coming up next in European history. So, in many places in Europe, including Croatia, fascism was coming into style, and a fascist group started in Croatia known as the Ustasha. And they were very much on the same side as Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. So when they invaded in 1941 and occupied the country, the Ustasha welcomed them with open arms and helped them to form the independent state of Croatia, which was just a puppet government for Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And of course, as we know, some very horrific things happened during this time. And like I always say on this channel, when we go over history and very horrific things happen, we're not going to get into detail about it because it is horrific, and I'm not just glossing over it like it was no big deal. It definitely was. I'm not dishonoring it. I'm not making fun of it, definitely. But this is a relaxation channel. It's meant to calm you and wind you down and educate you as well. So, bad things are going to happen. I'm saying it very briefly and moving on. Not in a way to, I always phrase it differently. I need to get a good phrase. And not to not show respect to anyone who perished during this time. I very much have respect for all of those individuals, but this is a relaxing time, so let's say it bluntly and briefly and move on. Was that during this time there was a very massive genocide. It's very awkward to say. I'm trying to say it calmly. There were many concentration camps built throughout Croatia, and there was a very large persecution against Serbs, Jews, Roma, eventually the Bosniaks, which were Bosnian Muslims, against any Croatians who opposed them, and of course against the people who fought against them, who were mainly communists, and their leader was named Josip Broz Tito. They were known as the Partisans, and they're considered the very first anti-fascist movement in Europe. They gained support from the Allies, even though they were communist. It was, enemy of my enemy is my friend. And with the help of the Soviet military, they wound up liberating the area in 1945. So since they were the ones in control, they wound up leading the new government, and Yugoslavia was formed as a socialist country led by Tito, who was a very charismatic, I almost want to say eccentric. At the end of the day, he was still a communist dictator, but he didn't like Stalin. He was kind of buddies with the United States and the other capitalist countries. He was just an interesting one. Not good, but not terrible, but it was what it was. So when he died in 1980, very suddenly, there was really no one to replace him. He was a very unique individual, I don't know how to describe Tito. A very interesting leader, let's say. The man who did wind up taking over was named Slobodan Milosevic, and to put it bluntly and relaxingly, wow, he was a very terrible person. The Croatians saw what was happening in Kosovo, Vojvodina, and Montenegro, and said, we do not condone this and we don't want to be part of this. They held a referendum and they declared their independence on June 25th, 1991. The Yugoslav People's Army came in to attack, and that started the Croatian War for Independence, which lasted until 1995. Again, just briefly mentioning some very terrible things. This war was very devastating for the country itself, the landscape, the cities, the people on both sides, honestly. Serbians living in Croatia, Croatians living in Serbia. Civilians, nobody won. So when peace eventually came, Croatia was in ruins. They literally had to pick themselves up by the bootstraps out of nothing and flip their country around. And they did, in my opinion, I try not to put my opinion in too much, but they did wonderful. They spent most of the 2000s focusing on economic recovery, focusing on growth in every aspect. Tourism was a big focus, and that helped them out tremendously. It's still a big tourist destination. Many Europeans consider Croatia their go-to. And they joined the EU in 2013, which is also a very big deal. They joined NATO as well. And Croatia, in a nutshell, is doing fantastic. Considering, it's 2021, we're just getting through a global pandemic. Considering it's doing fine. I was looking through recent history in the past 5-ish years or so, and it was just your basic politics of elections and transitions and things like that. The typical boring political things, which is very good. If your political news is boring, that means things are going well. If it's tumultuous or exciting, things are not going well. So that is going to be our history of Croatia for now. We will be back eventually. We're actually going to go to a neighbor in a few days. If you are a viewer who's trying to figure out what order I'm going in, today and tomorrow and the day after is going to be a good opportunity to find out. Croatia and the next two countries I'm doing have something in common. And if you listen closely, you might figure out what it is. And if you can figure out what it is, you're going to figure out the pattern. So that's it for tonight. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational. And above all, I hope that you have a very good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night.